What happens when Hollywood's most unshakable legend walks into late night's most unpredictable arena? Clint Eastwood came to Jimmy Kimmel Live to talk about his new film, but instead, he walked into a storm. What started as banter turned into a battle of respect versus ridicule, dignity versus ego. And when a 94-year-old icon decides he's had enough, you don't just hear it. You feel it. Clint Eastwood was introduced to the crowd like Hollywood royalty. The man who made squinting an art form. The cowboy. The cop. The director. The growl heard around the world, Clint Eastwood. The audience roared as the band played a bold Western riff. Clint stood from his chair backstage, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the stage at a slow, deliberate pace. His handshake with Jimmy Kimmel was brief but firm. He sat down, legs crossed, back straight, eyes scanning the set like a man sizing up a battlefield. Jimmy started with charm. "So, Clint, this new film of yours, another dusty cowboy epic, or have you finally decided to join us in the 21st century?" The crowd laughed. Clint gave a faint smile. "It's about a man protecting what's his," he said. "Some things don't change, Jimmy." For several minutes, they spoke about the film, a drama about an aging rancher fighting to keep his land from a corrupt corporation. Clint's voice was low, steady, and every word felt deliberate. The audience hung on his every sentence. But Jimmy kept glancing at his cue cards. And soon, the teasing began. "You're 94 now, right? That's incredible. You still get on a horse without breaking a hip." The audience exploded with laughter. Clint's gaze tightened slightly. "Don't ride much these days," he said calmly. "Don't need to prove I can." Jimmy grinned. "Come on. You're telling me you don't have a rocking chair on set?" More laughter followed. Backstage, Clint's assistant Maggie muttered, "He's pushing it." Clint didn't react at first. He simply squinted at Jimmy, the same quiet stare he'd worn in countless movies. "Not yet," Clint said evenly. "But keep it up, maybe I'll sit you in one." The audience gasped, some laughing nervously. Jimmy smiled like he still had control, but Clint's patience was running out. "So," Jimmy said, "you've been making movies since, what, the Civil War? Do you ever watch your old films and think, man, that guy had energy? Wonder where he went?" The audience laughed again, but softer this time. Clint leaned back, folding his arms. "Not really," he said. "You don't think you've lost a step?" Jimmy pressed. Clint's voice sharpened. "Not sure what you've done that makes you qualified to measure my steps." The room went still. A few claps came from the back. Jimmy tried to laugh it off. "Lighten up, Clint. You're a legend. I'm just keeping it fun." Clint's jaw tightened. "Fun's fine. Mockery isn't." The audience shifted uneasily. Maggie backstage took a deep breath. She knew this was headed somewhere bad. Jimmy held up his hands. "Hey, it's just jokes." Clint leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "There's a difference between jokes and disrespect. You'd do well to learn it." The smirk on Jimmy's face faltered for a moment. Okay. I'll behave. Let's talk about the movie." But the air had changed. This was no longer an interview, it was a standoff. The audience grew quiet. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the occasional nervous cough. Jimmy's usual confidence looked a little shaky. Clint sat still, hands folded in his lap, his eyes locked on the host like a hawk watching its prey. Jimmy tried to move forward. "So Clint, this new movie, The Last Stand, sounds kind of autobiographical. Like maybe this is your last hurrah." The crowd laughed, but the sound was hesitant now. "I've still got plenty left in me," Clint said evenly, but there was an icy edge to his tone. Jimmy chuckled. Sure. But at your age, can you still direct those big scenes? You don't forget what you're doing halfway through a take." The laughter that followed was sharper, almost mean. Maggie clenched her jaw. "Oh no," she whispered. "He's crossing the line." Clint didn't answer right away. He just stared at Jimmy, letting the silence stretch long enough to make the host squirm in his chair. Jimmy fidgeted with his cards. Finally, Clint spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "Tell me something, Jimmy. Do you really think that being quick with a joke makes you smart? Or does it just make you loud? The audience froze. There were no laughs this time, only tension. Everyone in the room knew this was no longer entertainment. This was Clint Eastwood reminding the world who he was. Jimmy Kimmel blinked in surprise. Clint Eastwood had just cut straight through his teasing. "You think age is a punchline?" Clint asked, his voice low but sharp. Jimmy hesitated. I'm just teasing, Clint. You know, keeping it light." Clint leaned forward slightly. The air in the room seemed to cool. "Sounds more like you're trying to turn me into a joke." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jimmy laughed nervously. No. You're a legend. Everyone knows that. I just thought you'd have a sense of humor about it." Clint's eyes didn't waver. "I do, when it's actually funny." The audience reacted instantly, half laughing, half clapping at the sharp comeback. Jimmy's smile flickered, but he pushed ahead, flipping through his cards. "All right," he said, "let's move on. So, Clint, you've been making movies since before color film." Backstage, Maggie groaned loudly enough for a stagehand to glance at her. Clint pressed his lips into a thin line. He looked down at his hands, then back at Jimmy. His voice was quiet, but it carried like a gunshot. "You've got a way of turning compliments into insults. That takes talent." The crowd erupted again, clapping and laughing, some even standing. Jimmy tried to settle them with a wave. Okay, fair enough. But come on, Clint, you're not exactly known for being lighthearted. Your movies are heavy, dark, angry." Clint raised an eyebrow. "They're about people who don't quit. People who stand for something. Does that bother you?" Jimmy chuckled awkwardly, glancing toward the producer off stage. "Not at all. Just wondering if maybe it's time for something lighter. You've earned the right to kick back. Let someone else do the fighting for once." Clint studied him for a moment, jaw tightening. Then he leaned forward, hands clasped together, speaking slowly and deliberately. "You think making movies is about me enjoying myself? You think telling stories that matter is just a hobby to pass the time? You don't get it, Jimmy. And I don't expect you to." The audience let out a collective "oh," some clapping, others murmuring. Jimmy forced a smile. "All right, point taken. Let's talk about directing. Does it ever get, confusing? Running a set with hundreds of people relying on you? Do you ever just forget where you are?" The crowd gasped. Backstage, Maggie's fists clenched. Clint's eyes hardened. When he spoke, it was softer, but the edge in his voice was unmistakable. "I don't forget. I know exactly where I am, even when I'm surrounded by people who've forgotten how to show respect." Jimmy opened his mouth, but Clint lifted a hand, stopping him. "You've had your fun. Maybe now we can talk about the movie, or you can keep making this about you." Jimmy blinked, caught off guard. The audience began to clap, slowly at first, then louder. All right, Jimmy muttered, flipping his cards again. "Let's talk about The Last Stand, in theaters Friday. Tell us about it." Clint leaned back, crossing his arms. He stared at Jimmy for a long moment before answering. "It's about a man who's been pushed too far. A man tired of being underestimated. Tired of being told to sit down and shut up because he's past his prime." The room fell silent. Backstage, Maggie whispered, "That's it. That's the turn." Jimmy tried to lighten the mood. "Sounds familiar," he joked. Clint's reply was immediate. "Maybe you ought to pay attention, Jimmy. You might learn something." The audience gasped, then broke into applause. Jimmy's smile faltered completely. His hands gripped the edge of his desk. He glanced at the floor producer, who gestured for a commercial break. But Clint wasn't finished. The studio lights felt hotter, brighter, almost like they were spotlighting every nerve in the room. Clint sat tall, his fingers slowly drumming on the arm of his chair, his eyes locked on Jimmy like a hawk studying prey. The crowd was split now, half cheering Clint, half trying to laugh along with Jimmy's strained jokes. But no one was comfortable anymore. Jimmy straightened his tie and leaned forward, his voice a little too loud. "All right, Clint. You've made, 5 40 or 50 movies. And in every single one, you're this brooding tough guy who scowls and mutters for 2 hours. Ever think about, I don't know, actually acting? Showing some range. The audience gasped again, a few groaning aloud. Backstage, Maggie muttered, he's lost his damn mind. Clint's jaw tensed, but his voice stayed calm, which somehow made it more dangerous. You think playing the same man for 50 years is easy? Try walking a mile in those boots before you talk about what acting is. Jimmy forced a laugh, but his hands gripped the desk tighter. Oh, come on, Clint. Don't get all high and mighty on me. I'm just saying, even Stallone tried. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, smirking. I'm just saying, he said, even Stallone tried comedy at some point. That was a mistake. Clint leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on Jimmy like steel. And that, he replied coolly, is why I'm not Stallone. The crowd exploded, clapping and cheering so loudly that Jimmy's next words were lost. Clint leaned back again, calm and unreadable, but the room's attention was locked entirely on him. Jimmy laughed, but the sound wavered halfway through. He fumbled with his cards, flipping to a new question like a man reaching for a life raft. All right, okay, he said, forcing a smile. Let's talk about directing. I mean, how does a guy your age? There was a ripple through the crowd at that. Keep up with the young crews? Do they carry you around the set like a mascot? This time, the reaction was sharper. Maggie, backstage, took one step onto the stage before a stagehand caught her arm and pulled her back. Clint tilted his head, his lips curling slightly, not into a smile, but into something closer to disappointment. You think you're clever, Clint said evenly, but you're just loud. The crowd erupted again, cheering and whistling. Jimmy's face flushed. He tried to laugh it off. Oh, come on, Clint. Everyone knows you're a legend. We're just having a little fun here, right? Clint didn't blink. You're having fun, he said flatly. But no one's laughing. The silence was sharp enough to cut the air. Jimmy leaned back, exhaling through his nose. All right, he said, his voice harder now. You want serious? Let's get serious. Do you even like making movies anymore? Or are you just clinging to this because you don't know what else to do with yourself? The audience booed. Maggie's fists clenched so tight her knuckles went white. Clint didn't answer right away. He simply stared at Jimmy for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. You really don't get it, he murmured. Jimmy pushed forward, feeling the tension but unable to stop himself. Honestly, Clint, maybe it's time to hang it up. Spend some time gardening, playing bingo, whatever it is guys your age do. The line was crossed. Clint straightened in his chair, his face turning to stone. His eyes narrowed into that unmistakable squint that had silenced men on and off screen for decades. And it worked. The entire studio went still. When he spoke, his voice was calm and deliberate, cutting through the air like a blade. You've spent this whole night trying to make me small, he said. And here you are, still looking up at me. The audience erupted, a standing ovation, some chanting his name, others openly booing Jimmy. Jimmy slammed his palm on the desk, his own temper breaking through. Oh, come on, he snapped. Don't act like you're some martyr here. You're just another washed-up cowboy who's overstayed his welcome. And you're sitting in my chair. Clint's jaw flexed as if he was holding back a storm of words. Then, without a sound, he rose from his seat. The crowd gasped. Jimmy froze, his eyes darting toward the producer off stage. Clint stood there for a long moment, towering over Jimmy, his presence filling the room. The weight of 50 years of grit and dignity bore down on the host. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but every person in the studio heard it. You should have quit while you were ahead. And with that, Clint stepped away from the chair, turning toward the curtain. The cameras followed him as the audience thundered, cheers, whistles, and a scattering of boos blending into one deafening roar. Jimmy sat frozen, staring at the empty chair. His face was red, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. Backstage, Maggie waited with Clint's coat in her hands. Her lips were pressed in a thin line, but there was pride in her eyes. The audience was still on their feet as Clint vanished behind the curtain, leaving Jimmy and the stage in a heavy silence. It wasn't over yet. The studio still buzzed from Clint Eastwood's quiet but devastating exit. The lights above flickered slightly, as if even they felt the weight of the moment. The camera stayed on Jimmy. His usual smug smile was gone, replaced by something close to panic. The band stayed silent. The audience sat divided, some clapping in Clint's honor, others staring at Jimmy, waiting. Jimmy straightened his tie and gave a weak laugh. "Well," he said, his voice cracking, "guess that went well, huh?" No one laughed. Behind the curtain, Clint walked with Maggie toward the back exit. His face was calm now, though his jaw twitched faintly. Crew members stepped aside as he passed, avoiding his gaze. One young producer, the same one who had suggested Jimmy have some fun with Clint, stepped into his path. "Mr. Eastwood, please wait," the young man stammered. We can fix this." Jimmy tried to pull the show back together. "Maybe," he said, forcing a smile toward the cameras, "if you just come back for one more segment." Clint Eastwood had already turned toward the exit. He stopped mid-step and slowly turned his head toward the young producer who'd made the suggestion. Clint's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but with the kind of sharp focus that made the producer take a step back without thinking. "I said what I came to say," Clint muttered, almost to himself. On stage, Jimmy shuffled his cue cards loudly, trying to fill the awkward silence. He forced a smirk. "Well, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice dipping back into sarcasm, "I guess Clint Eastwood's not quite as tough as he looks. Can't take a few jokes from a late-night clown like me." This time, the reaction wasn't laughter. The audience booed, loud and unrelenting. From somewhere in the back, a voice shouted, "He made you look small, Jimmy." Jimmy froze. His lips parted slightly, and for the first time that night, he seemed unsure of what to do. The boos didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder. Then the chant began. "Clint! Clint! Clint!" Backstage, Clint stopped walking just a few steps from the exit. He stood still for a moment, then turned around. Maggie, his longtime assistant, stayed right beside him, watching closely as he walked back toward the curtain. When Clint stepped back into view, the studio exploded with cheers and applause. The noise was deafening. Whistles, shouts, more chants of his name. Most of the crowd was on his side now. Jimmy's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. Clint didn't sit down. He stood behind his chair, looking directly at Jimmy until the crowd's cheers faded into silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried through the room like a shot. "I wasn't going to say anything more," he said. "But you just couldn't let it go, could you?" Jimmy started to reply, but Clint lifted one hand, steady, deliberate, and Jimmy fell silent. "You think this is a game? A circus?" Clint asked. "You think you can bring anyone out here, make fun of them, and the audience will laugh because you tell them to?" He stepped closer to the desk. "You tried to make me your punchline tonight. But all you did was show everyone here, and everyone watching at home, exactly who you are." The crowd gasped. Then they clapped again, even louder than before. Jimmy didn't move. His fingers gripped the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles turned white. "You think you've got power because you've got cameras and an audience," Clint continued. He shook his head. "No. What makes a man powerful is knowing when to speak, and when to shut the hell up." Jimmy's face flushed deep red. His jaw tightened, but no words came out. Clint leaned forward, placing both hands firmly on the desk, locking eyes with Jimmy. "You're lucky," Clint said quietly, "because all I'm walking away with tonight is my dignity. But you'll have to sit here, night after night, and look at that empty chair. And remember what happened here." Clint straightened up, turned his back, and walked away from the desk. The audience erupted into cheers, clapping, shouting, chanting his name again. "Clint! Clint! Clint!" Jimmy sat motionless, the sound pouring over him like a tidal wave. The band hesitated before starting a weak, awkward tune, but hardly anyone noticed. All eyes followed Clint as he disappeared behind the curtain. Back in the hallway, the chants were still faintly audible. Maggie walked beside him, her steps quick to keep pace. She glanced up at him and smiled with quiet pride. "That," she said softly, "was one hell of a closer." Clint didn't answer. He pushed open the exit door and stepped into the cool night air. The darkness swallowed him, leaving Jimmy, the studio, and the entire internet buzzing with what they had just seen. And that night, everyone was reminded what dignity looks like, not when things are easy, but when someone refuses to be disrespected. What about you? Was Clint right to stand up for himself, or did he go too far? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another behind-the-scenes moment that changes everything.